All right, you're rolling.
All right, if you just want to look right at me. So you met Mr. Armstrong in 1979. What was the extent of your encounter with him?
Well, that was the first time I had a chance to meet him, and I was among a group of people. That was the 10th anniversary of the moon landing. And of course, everybody in the world wanted to interview him, including me. I was a reporter at the paper here. And so I requested an interview. Of course, I was declined. And later on, Neil had a change of heart. He decided he would hold a small press conference, pretty small, very small, in fact, and only invited people who would be allowed in. And he invited me, not because he invited me, but because I was from the paper of Purdue's hometown. And so I got to go. And it was an incredible experience. You know, there were all these famous journalists there, a very small group of people. And I remember very well the question I asked him. I said, are you satisfied with what you said when you landed on the moon, that's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind? He said, really, that wasn't the important thing I said that day. I said, well, and what was? He said, the Eagle has landed. He said it was very difficult to land that lunar module, very difficult. We'd never done it. He said, personally, I believe we had a 50-50 chance of success, 50% chance of failure. By failure, he meant abort and go back, crash on landing, or not be able to take off. But he felt the odds 50-50 were good enough for him because he was in control and he was doing the landing. So that was a pretty surprising thing to me, and I've heard him say that before. He's often quoted as saying, pilots like to fly, they don't like to walk. He said the walk was just for show, once they collected some lunar samples. So the Eagle has landed is the words that he thought people should remember. That was an amazing press conference because when it was over, Morton Dean from CBS walked up to him, took off the cardboard press conference badges we had, handed it to Neil to get his autograph. And he said, Walter Cronkite wants me to say hello, you know, and they were talking about Walter Cronkite, and he signed the press pass. Well, everybody else got in line, and you know that's unheard of at a press conference. I've never seen it before, and I've never seen it since. But this was Neil Armstrong. This was something special. And all the journalists at that press conference lined up and got their press badges signed. That, of course, was before Neil stopped signing autographs. He stopped signing autographs toward 2000, when he started seeing his autograph for sale for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. And professional autograph people were trying to send children to him to get an autograph and then sell it. He stopped signing everything completely, never signed anything. But he still met with people and talked to people and allowed people to take their picture with him. In 2000, not many people had a camera in their pocket. But by the end of his life, everybody had a camera in their pocket. And sometimes I remember once walking him across the campus, and students would yell, Neil, can we get your autograph? He'd say, I don't sign autographs, but come on, we'll take a picture. And he'd pose for a picture with them. And I think today, those pictures are probably more valuable to those students than the autograph would have been.
What did you learn from Neil as a person during that encounter?
Well, in the encounters I had with Neil, I learned that he was a very modest person. I think his family called him a reluctant hero when he died. When President Kennedy said we need to send a man to the moon and bring him home safely by the end of the decade, he said much more than that day. We only remember that one line. He said this is going to be tremendously expensive. It's going to take a tremendous amount of human resources to get this done. Don't do it unless you're willing to commit 100% to this. And he said, when we do land a man on the moon, and it was only a man at that time, when we do land a man on the moon, it won't be that single person accomplishing the goal. It will be the entire country, because we're all going to be involved in it in some way, through paying taxes, supporting the program, whatever. And that's the way Neil felt. Neil felt I was in the tip of that rocket. I ended up being the first person to walk on the moon. But there were thousands of engineers and scientists and workers behind me, and the whole country was involved in accomplishing the goal. He wanted to share it with everybody. He didn't want to take the credit solely himself. And so he kind of stepped back a little bit and didn't appear on all the nighttime TV shows and didn't answer questions from journalists. He answered questions from space historians. He would sit down people who were legitimate space historians and talk to them. And everything about that trip, he downloaded to NASA. And it's all online now. Anybody can look it up and find out what was going on every second of that flight. But he didn't boast about it. He was never a boastful person. when he was here as a student, he came on a Navy program where he had a scholarship, and he was to go a couple years. He was to go 2 years to Purdue, then go into the Navy, and then come back and finish his degree while he's in the reserves. Actually, he only got a year and a half in before the Navy called him up. He ended up serving in Korea. He was a jet pilot, went on many combat missions in Korea, flying off an aircraft carrier. Then came back to Purdue, a much older student. He came here in 47, 17 years old, graduated 8 years later in 1955. He was a much older student at that time, older than many of the students that were here. He was a war veteran. He was a jet pilot. On weekends, he went up to Glenview in Chicago and flew jet airplanes. But the people who knew him as a student said he never bragged about that. He never went around saying, I'm a jet pilot, he didn't brag about his accomplishments when he was a student, and he didn't brag about them for the years after the moon landing.
From your experiences with Neil and what you know everything of him now after his passing, what legacy has he left behind?
Well, Neil, and I say Gene Cernan and Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee helped to attract other people to this university who wanted to become astronauts. All these other people who were involved in the shuttle program knew Neil Armstrong, and those others came here, and they thought must be a good route to become an astronaut. It still goes on today. I never talk to a group of students on this campus about the space program and Purdue's involvement in flight that one or two students don't want me afterwards and say, I am here because I want to be an astronaut. I want to be the first person on Mars. So they're still coming here following Neil Armstrong's lead. And I think the legacy he leaves us is how to conduct yourself personally, how to be a human being who cares about other human beings and is not self-centered, cares about the world. Neil was a funny person. He had a lot of fun. He told me once he played 10 instruments during his life, none of them well, but he played 10 instruments. He played the bass horn in our band. He loved to play the piano, especially at gatherings of astronauts out at Edwards Air Force Base when they were young and having a party. He was a fun guy. People think he was a little aloof. I didn't find him aloof at all. I found him very friendly. He just didn't want to have everybody asking him about what was it like to walk on the moon.
Did he ever speak of his hometown when he interacted with him?
Wapakoneta, of course, Wapakoneta was important to him. That's where he went to high school. That's where he learned to fly an airplane at the age of 16 before he could drive a car. He flew a plane home from Purdue once there during his college years and he did some damage to it, had a little problem. They had to put it on a trailer and haul it back. Of course, he got a lot of kidding for that. Wapakoneta was important to him. It was an important part of his life.
Have you been to the museum?
I unfortunately have not, but it's on my bucket list for sure to go there. And I've been amazed at some of the things that came here or that turned up, after he died. He never talked about these things. We find out, after he died that he kept all the letters that people sent him. There's thousands of them in our archives. They were in Wapakoneta. It's just amazing. We found out in the auction he had recently, they took pieces of the propeller from the Wright brothers plane with him into space and other items like this. He never told people about this. He just didn't talk about it. He was a very private person in some ways. But I want people to understand that while he was private, he was very friendly and outgoing and fun. And he loved Purdue. He loved Purdue. He was so good to Purdue and shared his time with Purdue and shared his time with our students.
Anything else you've had?
Well, I remember so many things about him. I came here. We dedicated this building in 2007, the fall of 2007, before a football game, Saturday morning. It was a terrible weather day. We dedicated the statue out there the day before. And while Neil was proud, the people donated to name this building for Neil. It wasn't something where Neil made a donation. People donated to name it for him. And they donated the statue, too, out there in front. And I think it's a beautiful statue. It's the way he looked when he graduated. Not when he came here, because he was 17 years old, and he hardly looked 17. He looked more like 14. He was a young man. But by the time he graduated, he was quite a bit older, 8 years older, and that's what he looked like. And I think that's a beautiful way to portray him to the students that are here, that they can see what Neil looked like when he was here. But Neil was a little sensitive to the fact of being present when they were dedicating that statue. He thought it might look a little arrogant on his part. He did not attend the dedication of the statue. Didn't mean he didn't like it. Just means he felt a little uncomfortable. So when he came here on Saturday, he pointed out that when he came here in 1947, that was when there's the big GI push. All the ex-GIs came on the GI Bill to universities around the country. During the war, Purdue's population dropped below 4,000. Its maximum capacity before the war was 7,000. By 1947, there were 14,000 students on this campus. There wasn't a place to stay any place. He had a hard time finding a room. And the 17-year-old boy, a freshman, found himself with freshmen who were ex-GIs here on the GI Bill, who were 26 years old and had spent the last 4 years fighting a brutal war. They were a lot different from Neil Armstrong, who I don't know if he'd ever been out of Ohio before he came into Indiana. So he gave a speech that day about this, and he said, you know, he was scared. He was scared to be engineering. He was scared of these other classmates that he had that were so much older and more mature. And he said, only Purdue would put a statue of a scared freshman in front of an engineering building. Also, I remember that day he flew in with his family. He flew in a big Bridgestone plane, landed at our airport, which is right here on campus. I was assigned to go out there and get him and his family. Had some Purdue cars out there in the tarmac. He came over and talked to me, and he said, take my wife and sons to the Union Hotel. I'm going back on the plane. So, well, okay, Neil, you know, whatever you want to do, but we are having a dinner tonight, and we hope you'll be there. And he said, I'll be back. I'll let you know when to pick me up. So he went back in the plane. So I had his wife, Carol, in the car with me. And I said, where's he going? Is he going back to fly and have some fun? She said, no. He left his speech on the table in the hallway back at home. So if you're Neil Armstrong and you leave your speech back, you know, in Ohio, you get back on an airplane, a jet airplane, and you fly back and get it. But then she said, oh no, the keys to his car are in the trunk, in the package in your trunk. He won't be able to drive his car back to the house. So I took her out to the terminal where they were pulling out of. They pulled away from the terminal. They couldn't talk to him there. I said, the only ones who could talk to him was the tower, and they won't. So I said to Carol, just call him on his cell phone. The plane's right there. And she said, Neil does not carry a cell phone. So the first man to land on the moon was a little reluctant to adopt our 21st century technology. I don't know if he finally did in the end or not. One night I was here, one of the last times he was on campus, and he and Gene, you know, go back a long way. They were friends during the space program. They knew each other a little bit when they were here on campus, only a year apart in graduation, and both in engineering. Several of us had a beer and pizza with Neil and Gene at a local place here, Bruno's. Incredible experience to sit there for an evening with the first and last men to walk on the moon. And people always say, what did they talk about? What did they talk about? Well, they talked about their friends. They talked about their families and their grandchildren. They talked about people they knew. They talked about their years at Purdue. The one thing they never talked about was walking on the moon.
That's well said.